Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Karen Kossie-Chernyshev. I'd like to welcome you to SWATH 2021, Absolute Equality, Pursuing the Promise. I am deeply honored that we have a number of scholars who are joining us today to help us understand some of the pieces of legislation, new laws that are coming out of the Texas State House. And in addition to that, we are celebrating Juneteenth being established as a national holiday, but then we also want to discuss these pieces of legislation that are going to impact the study, teaching, and even perhaps research. We just want to talk with educators who are experts in various fields. We have people from the legal profession. We have folks from higher education, from secondary ed also, who will be able to help us understand what's going on with these new pieces of legislation. So my name is Dr. Karen Kossie-Chernyshev. I happen to be the founding director of SWATH. We started in 2013. Our first workshop was in 2014. We had 5 consecutive workshops. We had a break in 2019 and also in 2020 because of the COVID virus, but we're back strong. These new pieces of legislation have let us know that there's plenty of work for us to do. We just want to make sure that we use our expertise to help members of the general public understand what's going on. So today we have Professor Brian Franklin, who is from the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. And we also have Dr. Colette Bloom, who is a professor of educational administration in the School of Education at Texas Southern University. And we have Dr. Ramona Houston, who's going to serve as moderator. Our leadership team this year it includes myself, Dr. Karen Kossie-Chernyshev, Nelva Williamson, who has attended every SWATH, and also Professor Tomiko Meeks of Texas Southern University. So today we're going to be looking at S475, the act that actually establishes Juneteenth as a national holiday, and also House Bill 3979, and we'll also have some commentary on House Bill 2497. And again, our moderator will be Ramona Houston, our special guest, Dr. Brian Franklin, and Dr. Colette Bloom of Texas Southern University. I'm going to yield the floor to Brian Franklin so he can talk to us about at least a couple of these bills.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I feel very honored to be with this group and get to share just a little bit that I've been learning and a little bit about my experience. And I hope it'll be helpful to you all and that we'll be able to have some great conversation. I welcome you all. You're welcome to keep your videos off or just your mics off. Once I pull up this slideshow, I'll probably be looking at a camera and my own screen anyway, but I really look forward to sharing with you and then to having some Q&A afterwards. So I've been teaching Texas history here at SMU for about 6 or 7 years, and I grew up in Texas, born in Texas, and never really expected that I would become some sort of Texas history expert, as the newspapers might call me when they give me a phone call. But I've found myself so interested and even galvanized as these new laws have been coming up that I just couldn't help but diving in and writing and advocating and learning about it. And so that's why I'm here with you today. I just want to do 3 things with you real quick in these kind of 10 or 15 minutes. The first, I don't want to assume everyone has kind of a full background on where this 1836 project comes from. And so I want to give you a little bit background on the 1619 project, where this HB 2497 or the 1836 project comes from, and then offer you an idea that I have, which is that these laws, as concerning as they might be, as constraining as they may be aimed at being, actually may offer opportunity if we approach them as teachers in the right way, in a specific way. So I want to offer that encouragement as well. I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm going to assume that it works out. Oh, I'm disabled here. Okay. Is it possible, Dr. Kossie, to make me a co-host at this point? If not, I can just talk. Okay, I'll let her chime in or send me a message if that comes up. But let me get started first with just saying a little bit about the 1619 project. I'm sure if anyone's been awake or watched any piece of news the last few months, they've heard of it, but you may not know a lot about it or where it came from. Here's the simple explanation. This was a project by the New York Times to commemorate August 2019 and the 400th anniversary of the beginning of American slavery. And it really had a pretty simple introduction and thesis. This was its point. I'm quoting right from the top of their website. The project aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. So that's it. What's the goal? What if we think about the founding and the early years of this country in a different way with an eye toward a different topic? That's the kind of thing that storytellers and historians and educators in your classrooms do all the time. Let's think about a story, but from a different angle. That's really all it was aimed at doing. And I think for the most part, it was received that way from a lot of scholars and historians as a new way to think about early America and a new way to think about how the legacy of slavery lives on in all sorts of things. Historians had critiques. Some didn't like it. Most seemed to be appreciative of it. Pretty normal historical process. Politics is where it became a problem because it began to gain ground at the same time as a lot of other issues that have to do with racial justice and the history of racism in our country all started coming together at the same time. Questions about monuments and policing and voting restrictions, all swirling around the same time as this 1619 project. And the opponents of it really couched it not as a way to think differently about history and what we might learn, but instead as a way to rewrite or change history for a political move. Now, in my view, this is a very unfair and inaccurate way to critique the project, but that is why it has gained so much ground. And it gained so much sort of partisan political ground that it inspired things like the 1836 project. This is House Bill 2497, passed just within the last couple months. You may have heard about it. Governor Abbott produced a video, kind of a signing ceremony of it. And this project is kind of playing off of the idea of 1619, but as proper Texans looking at our own founding date of 1836. And the bill itself, in its text, is actually, in my reading, much more tame than what a lot of the response that came from it. It really just does three things. I want to mention these three things to you before I kind of hopefully offer you some encouragement and maybe some ideas. So the first thing is that it calls for the creation of a committee that will advise the governor and advise a bunch of different state agencies on, and this is the key phrasing here, how to promote patriotic education and Texas values. It doesn't define that terribly what patriotic education means, and it only lists a few things that it considers as Texas values. But one thing that comes up constantly in the just 2.5-page document is this principle or idea of founding. It calls for study of founding and foundational principles. It calls for study and reading of the founding documents. It calls for students to learn about the founders of Texas. And it calls on this committee to advise the government and the governor on how they may promote all these things, all these founders, all these founding ideas. The second thing it does, which is really specific, and you'll be thankful that your tax dollars are at work on this, because it requires the DMV to produce a pamphlet. Now, I know you're all thinking, this is exactly what we need, another pamphlet. This will solve all our problems. Well, next time you go get your driver's license, then you'll be able to get this pamphlet, a pamphlet that promotes the idea of Texas as a place of economic prosperity and abundant opportunity. And the last thing it does is it calls for that committee to produce some kind of student award that the governor can give out as an award for knowledge of these founding documents and these founding principles of Texas. Now, on its face, that seems pretty tame. You might be thinking, though, well, what are these founding principles? What are these values? What is it actually trying to get at? Because if we look at the politics surrounding this, it's clearly more than just let's say nice things about history. It's aimed at countering ideas that come out of things like the 1619 Project, which say, hey, there are real issues that we need to deal with in our history that have legacies that continue to today. And it's trying to counter that idea. In that way, it can sound very constraining and in some ways, potentially even a little oppressive, right? That you would come into my classroom and tell me as a teacher what I can and can't talk about or what I should focus on. I want to offer you kind of a way to think about this that I hope will help you still succeed in the classroom and help your students do so, and essentially not worrying about what this particular law does for a very specific reason. And that's this. This law wants us as teachers to focus on the founding documents of Texas history. Now, the law has a particular agenda. They think it will lead to one place or another, but many of you who teach history, Texas history, American history, if you're familiar at all with some of the founding documents of Texas, then in the words of Inigo Montoya, I do not think it means what you think it means, if you're a Princess Bride fan along with me, right? The idea that we're going to go to these founding documents and discover only ideas of prosperity and freedom and opportunity for all, well, that's just not what's there. And so what I want to encourage you to do is to go to a few documents and say, hey, this is what the law is calling me to do. Let's read them together. And so let me just give you 3 examples. I could give you many, but I just want to focus on 3. All right, the first one is the Constitution of the Republic of Texas from 1836. Okay, group of men got together, wrote up the Constitution that would be the foundational governing document of the Republic of Texas for its 10 years of existence. And in it, you'll find a lot of different ideas and values, some of which exist all the way up through today, values that maybe both the left and the right would espouse, things like divided government or religious freedom. These are in the document. But there are other values that are in the text, in the document, that may not track very well in 2021. Here are some examples, particularly those that get at issues of race and of Black history in Texas. It was illegal for Congress to emancipate slaves, right? So as some of the national direction was moving toward this, questions of emancipation and abolition, the Texas Constitution makes it very plain that the Congress may not do any such thing. It was illegal for an individual, a slave owner, an enslaver, to actually emancipate their own slave without consent of Congress. So there's this very strange mashup of the importance of property and men, and yet within the Republic, there's not actually a legal allowance to do with that so-called property what a property owner might want to do. Even if an African-American or Black person was free in the Republic of Texas, they were by law not allowed to remain living there without specific permission from the state. And finally, here's another quote straight from the Constitution of the Republic. It said that all people who were residing in Texas when the Declaration of Independence was signed, quote, shall be considered citizens of the Republic and entitled to all the privileges of such, except Africans, the descendants of Africans, and Indians. Right, so very clear in the language here, even more clear than you'll find in the United States founding documents, which tend to be a little bit more circumspect about how they hide things. In Texas, it's very clear. Everyone who was here when the Declaration was signed can be a citizen and have all the rights except for these very specific people. So that's one document that we might read per the governor's suggestion. How about a second one? The second president of the Republic of Texas, Mirabeau Lamar. He gave a message to Congress in December of 1838. It's relatively short. You could pull this up with your student, right? What teacher, what principal, what governing official is going to balk at the idea that you would read a presidential address as they've asked you to do, a founding document? Well, he was the second president of the Republic, and in his message to Congress, he explicitly called for quote, the total extinction or the total expulsion of all indigenous peoples in Texas. The total extinction or the total expulsion. For Mirabeau Lamar, the president of the republic, in an open message to Congress, there was only one place for Native peoples in Texas, and that was to either be killed or to be kicked out of Texas. And he actually made good on this in some ways when he sent an army to attack and massacre many of the Cherokee who were living in Texas at the time, who had already had legally binding treaties with the Republic of Texas. Another founding document, maybe not one that promotes freedom and opportunity for everyone, but a founding document nonetheless. And then the last one that I want to share with you here is something called the Declaration of Causes. Not sure how many people are familiar here, and so just a little bit of background. In 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president, multiple states decided that they were going to then leave the United States, that if Abraham Lincoln was president, then basically that meant for them that slavery was on its way out and that they better be on their way out. So multiple states decided to leave. And the way they did this was people within the state would elect these conventions, these what they called either constitutional conventions or secession conventions. And Texas did this very soon after. February of 1861 called a convention to consider secession. And they produced a document when they decided to leave. And it was called a Declaration of Causes. And essentially it was this: let me explain to the world, not let me, let us, the Republic of Texas, the state of Texas, explain to the world why exactly we are going to leave the United States. This is why, in their own words. And this is key because some of the things that come up in these documents, many people, especially in a partisan world, will try to say we're trying to revise things or trying to change things or trying to add things. This is not revision. This is not race baiting. This is a founding document in the words of the people who wrote it. And these are some of the things that are in that document from 1861. This convention believed in undeniable truths, that their state had been established, quote, exclusively by the white race for themselves and their posterity. In Texas, Black folks had no agency and were, quote, rightfully held and regarded as inferior and dependent race. And then, you know, one of the things that the 1836 project calls for real specifically is that teachers and students would learn more about the Christian heritage of the state. Well, in the Declaration of Causes, they write this: that it was the revealed will of the Almighty Creator to all Christian nations to practice slavery, to believe that some people were inferior by birth. Now, this is a kind of Christian heritage spoken by people who claim to be Christians, but it's not necessarily the kind of Christian heritage that maybe the bill is aiming at. But it's right there in the document. So let me close here, and I want to offer just kind of very quick conclusion and exhortation to you. The 1836 project, HB 2497, it doesn't really define its terms well, doesn't get very precise about what it teaches. It's about prosperity and founding and heritage, all toward a particular socio-political vision of Texas. I would like to encourage you to consider trying to stay out of that quagmire as teachers, because it's something that I imagine you could very quickly get trapped in. I want to exhort you to not get caught up as much as possible in the kind of partisan political gaming that goes on when you're figuring out what you teach in your classroom. Now, I am not saying that you shouldn't speak out. We should. I've been writing. I try to speak out when I can from what I do here at SMU. And if you're being unfairly restricted or constrained, then we should absolutely speak out. But what I am saying is that when you're in the classroom, you don't have to be an apostle for the 1619 project or the 1836 project. You don't have to advocate for critical race theory or against critical race theory, which, as we were talking before this started, most of us don't ever talk about anyway in our classrooms. All you've got to do under laws like this is just keep doing even more focused the kinds of things you're already doing. Teach the history. Hand the documents to the students and say, let's read them together. You don't need CRT. You don't need 1619 or their opponents to be able to pull out what's really there and then talk about with your students the questions that they will inevitably ask. Well, what does this mean for our history? What does this mean for today? And there's no Texas bill out of the House or the Senate that's going to be able to stop that from happening. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate your presentation. Now we're going to hear from Dr. Colette Bloom.
Hello, everyone. I enjoyed listening to Brian's presentation also. And as I listened to it, I do feel that the discussion that we had earlier really plays into this now, because we were talking about critical race theory. And many people don't have a clear understanding of what that is. And critical race theory, I wrote my dissertation on critical race theory when it was just beginning to come out. And critical race theory actually is based on, comes out of critical legal studies. And critical legal studies were compiled by a group, a very dynamic group of African-American legal scholars. And they wrote about how the laws have been used to oppress and to maintain and sustain the way that the dominant race has control of the country, has total control of institutions, especially governmental institutions. And in this case, after what Brian has told us about, how that law was used to oppress Native Americans and African Americans. So we know that the law is a powerful weapon to use to keep people in their place. And if you get the right group of people together to be in their place, then you end up having, you have a group of people in the legislature who are very like-minded, and they can come together and create these, what I call just egregious law products. These law products that they've, it's basically hate codified. And so I have to look at all of this in a way, using an educator's point of view, because that's what I am primarily. I'm a teacher first. I taught 14 years in the classroom. I've taught in elementary, middle, high school. I've been a principal of a school in Austin. And now as a professor, I get to have the academic freedom that's necessary to come out and discuss these topics. And I'd like to show to you, this is the book. This is the book, Critical Race Theory. This was my Bible when I was writing my dissertation. And it's called Critical Race Theory, the Key Writings That Formed the Movement. And this book is the foundational book for anyone that wants to read or learn more about what critical race theory is. And basically, that's what it is. It's a way of looking at the American legal system and how it has perpetuated oppression for minority people in this country. And even when I started in this 20 years ago, many people on my dissertation committee didn't even know what it was. And they just, I guess they had to learn from me, but it was an interesting journey. And now suddenly 20, 21 years later, I'm hearing all of this about critical race theory. And I'm going, what is going on? This has been around for years. Well, it's come into the public's consciousness, and by coming into the public's consciousness, it also has created a sort of backlash that ends up being, helps in the writing of 3979, this bill. But there also was another type of writing that came out, that type of writing used the term whiteness. And there were books that were coming out on whiteness. There were courses in universities on whiteness studies. This is the book, it's called Critical White Studies, that talks about and delves into the understanding of how and why whiteness became a property right of white people in America. And it basically became a signal to everyone that if you were not white, then you were the other. And if you're the other, you're also someone that doesn't belong with the in group. So I'm not going to talk about that too much. But I teach a course right now and have been teaching it for over 11 years. And it's called The History of Black Education in America. One of the things that I discovered in that course, teaching predominantly African-American students, was that very few of my students knew anything about African-American history. And most of them were shocked, they were surprised, and they were angry that they didn't know that. And I remember one student particularly saying, why didn't I ever learn this? And so when we talk about what it is that students need to know, we need, and I'll show that in my short slide presentation, there's a penalty that students pay for not having the right information or the truth, factual information. And not having factual information or not being taught in certain parts of our history is really educational abuse. It doesn't allow students to become critical thinkers. It doesn't allow them to use advanced organizers to build on their knowledge base, and it makes them less able to discuss points in our body politic. So I became very aware of this, and it really was upsetting to me. So what I've now decided to do is that when I teach this course, I teach this course knowing that most of our students, because I know I never learned it in the 50s, nobody taught it to me, that our students are craving this information. They really, really want to know their history. And they feel like they've been abused for not learning this history. So these are some of the books that I use. And I want to note that the books that I use are written by very well-known African-American not legal scholars, but historical scholars. But I purposefully made sure that I used African-American historians when I selected the books for this course. And it has really been very beneficial to me in discussing it. And by using these particular books, I allow students to ask questions that maybe I can't even generate or even come up with in a quiz. They ask some very profound and very deeply critical questions about history. And about, if, for example, in slavery, they ask questions about the use of the female body in slavery and how that became the source of the slave masters to earn money by the production of new slaves. So that's a whole other area of study, the use of the Black enslaved female and how it was used. And these discussions fall into and move into today's discussions, especially when we talk about topics such as black girl magic. So many of those are to try and dispel all of these old notions of Black women's bodies. But these are the books. The first book, I don't know if you can see it, but the first book is by James D. Anderson, and it's called The Education of Blacks in the South from 1860 to 1935. This is the seminal work by Dr. Anderson, who wrote about the schooling of slaves post Civil War during the era of Reconstruction. The next one is, now this is one that really is interesting to students. It's called The White Architects of Black Education by William Watkins out of Chicago. And this textbook talks about how the Northern philanthropists used Booker T. Washington primarily to develop the Hampton model and the use of manual labor, that they would become skilled manual laborers. This book is by Nell Irvin Painter, and it's called Creating Black Americans. And this particular book was written, and I use it. It's more of a textbook, but what it does do in this particular book, it has pictures, drawings, sculpture, African art all throughout the book. And so as we talk, we can also discuss all of these models. So, and then this is another one, The Struggle for Freedom. This one is done by Claiborne Carson and others. He's out of Stanford, another Black historian. So when you compile using these kinds of textbooks and having academic freedom, it allows us to let the text and the readings in the text guide the discussion. So if I can, just for a minute, I'm going to share my screen about this. Let me get rid of this. And I entitled this The Miseducation of Texas School Children 2.0, how the Texas legislature reduces learning through lies of omission. And part of, oh, I'm sorry. This came, I'm going to do a short quote here, and it came from Seth Kotler, who's also a historian, who says the responsibility of the state's leaders to speak honestly about the past. It's their responsibility. Whitewashing history serves only to perpetuate historical injustices. Teaching rising generations the truth about history won't magically make everything better, but we can move forward together with a relatively shared and accurate understanding of where we've been. And I would guess that most of us would agree with that. This slide is important in the sense that historical data also comes from a source. And so when you're reading history, you need to know who gathered the facts, how did they gather the facts, why did they gather the facts, and why were particular events eliminated from the Texas Education Code in this case. Why were they eliminated? And what does that do to students when you eliminate knowledge facts, developing a factual knowledge base? What is the impact of this miseducation on students? Now, I'm saying this from an educational standpoint, not a historical standpoint, but it's still the same. No parent would agree to a school district jumping over learning your ABCs and going right into reading without knowing the letters of the alphabet. If the Texas Education Code put that in there, you would see a firestorm. I hope that this kind of document creates a firestorm. But what is the actual impact on students with this? One thing, what fact knowledge does, I'm not just saying knowledge, I'm saying fact knowledge. Learning facts creates a strong knowledge base on which to build these three areas: critical thinking, problem solving, and reasoning. Because you can, if you have this foundation, it's much easier for you to listen to the next topic and go back to what you previously learned. Fact knowledge is cumulative. If you have facts, it's basically like the little thing on television. The more you know, the more you can learn. And so fact knowledge for students, and this comes out of brain research, it'll stick to any new knowledge that you give them. So if you give them, if you're talking about 1619 and the Africans being brought over to as enslaved persons, then that, if that's a fact, then you can now move into the discussion of why it was done and who is being served by this. And it also gives context and aids to comprehension. The next thing that fact knowledge helps with students is that it creates what's known as the elaboration effect on the brain. That if you have a fact and you repeat that fact and you repeat that fact, then it's easier to remember something, and it can be associated with existing information, because knowledge grows exponentially, not just over time. That once a student becomes conversant and begins to understand a set of circumstances, they can now move into the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, where it gets up to judgment and evaluation. And that's what we want when we produce our citizenry. We want children who grow up, go to college, finish school, that they can make reasoned choices, reasoned rational decisions. So people with prior fact-based knowledge are better at drawing analogies as they gain experience and expertise in specific areas. So what are the, in closing, what are the advantages of teaching facts in Texas history? Well, I think it's these three. You can agree, disagree, and even add to it. It builds a fact-based citizenry. We know now we have many people that are disavowing science, but we need students to have facts and to use primary sources like Brian did, to use those primary sources to prove your point, not just your opinion. It also promotes democracy, and it improves the literacy rate in history and civic education. And that was the end. So that's, in closing, I would like to say that there are other repercussions that come from these kinds of legal documents as it applies to our students in Texas, not just Black students, white students too, because we could ask the question, what are the advantages of white students learning about Black history? There are advantages. What are those advantages? And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bloom. I really appreciate all of those challenging questions, because there are many that we need to really think about deeply. I'm going to yield the floor now to Dr. Ramona Houston, and she's going to lead us through some questions. So those of you who are part of the audience now, please feel free to post questions in the chat. And in fact, if we can just make sure we don't talk over each other, if you have a question you want to pose, feel free to do that, maybe by raising a hand. But when you're not speaking, just keep your microphone off. Okay, so go ahead, Dr. Houston.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Atlanta, Georgia. I am Ramona Houston, and as a native Texan and a Texas historian, it's a pleasure to be here this year for SWATH 2021. SWATH stands for Summer Workshop on African American Texas History. Thank you to Dr. Kossie-Chernyshev and her committee for planning this educational event, which is very much needed in our society today. Today, we're talking about Texas House Bill 2497, and we're exploring the issues of Project 1836, as well as some issues regarding the study of history and the study of education and how we teach, as well as critical race theory. We're taking questions, and if any of you have any questions, please put them in the chat box for those of you who are joining us via Zoom. Others who are joining us via Facebook Live, please put your questions in the box. You may also raise your hands. We've heard from two outstanding panelists today, Dr. Brian Franklin. Dr. Franklin is the Associate Director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, and he is a graduate of Texas A&M University, and Dr. Colette Bloom, who is a tenured professor at Texas Southern University, and she is also a graduate of Texas A&M University. They are both doctoral graduates there. Dr. Franklin, for those of you who are just joining us, he welcomes the whole process of teaching from original Texas documents, as he explained in his presentation. And he explained that teaching from those documents, you can really still bring out the truth, as Dr. Bloom stated. It's all about teaching the truth. And if you missed his presentation, you can check out his article in Slate, which is an online news magazine. The 1836 Project is an opportunity to teach. So if you missed his presentation, please see that there. There is a request for you, Dr. Bloom, who explored critical race theory in her presentation, that we have a reading list. If you could produce a reading list for Dr. Kossie-Chernyshev to include on the Facebook page in the Zoom Live event as an attachment. One of the questions that we have that has come through is, what are the advantages of white students learning African American history? I know Dr. Bloom, you expanded upon that in your discussion on critical race theory, and you even called some of the untruths that are taught and the truth that is not taught as educational abuse. I've never heard that. And but could you explain why, or what are the advantages of white students learning about African American history?
Well, it is their history too. And they have, I taught in a course of Black history, the same Black history course when it as a professor, and it was at a site in northern Houston, and I had many white students in that course. In fact, I had more white students than I did Black students. So I thought it was going to be a very interesting project to see what's going to come from this. And the first question I asked was, how many of you in here believe that racism exists in America? They all raised their hands. And I said, well, how many in here are racist? No one raised their hand. So the idea that, and I'm saying even Black students didn't raise their hands. No one raised their hands because no one sees themselves as being a racist, but they know racism exists. You could perform the same task in a football stadium, and no one's going to admit that they're racist. But I think it's important that students understand that and need to know what is the original, why is the original founding of this country the place to begin to learn about where we are today with racism. They need to study and to know the things that were done, and some of these atrocities certainly had an impact on the lives of Black Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans with the Chinese Exclusion Act today. We still have the repercussions, the what I call the vestiges of history still linger with us today. And we can't just say that it's something that, oh, that happened, that's not a part of me. It is a part of you because you are in fact, you hold advantages because of our founding history. You hold advantages that we never had. So I think it's not a credible stance to say that I don't want to learn Black history. Black history is the basis for capitalism in this country. Slavery is the basis for capitalism all over America. So why would you not want to know how a large group of people in this country were set apart and set upon to do things that would make another group of people very wealthy? It's critical that they know it, not to blame, but to understand. And that's the goal of education, is to teach for understanding. And now you can become a critical, constructive, critical thinker when you make decisions, because you have a foundational understanding of it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloom, for that answer. And to add to that, Malcolm X stated years ago that by teaching African-American history, not only do you stop the inferiority complexes within African-Americans, but you also help to stop the superiority complexes among white students. Thank you very much for that answer, Dr. Bloom. On to you, Dr. Franklin. You talked about the 1836 project, and what recommendations would you give to public school educators on how to teach history in a way that's holistic, that it includes African-American history, as well as a broader understanding of what Texas history is about, the truth about Texas history?
Yeah, well, if I might just riff a little bit on what I said in my presentation, I think primary documents are an excellent way to do this, because they give us the views of real people at a real moment in time, and real people at real moments in time in the past aren't always the exact helpful tool that we may want them to be for our current political aim or the current thing that we want to do. They're more complex than that, and they're speaking to their own issues. And so, for example, reading the Declaration of Independence, Texas's Declaration of Independence, is going to serve a lot of purposes, and it works really well in the classroom, because a student who really wants to know a little bit more about, well, how did things like slavery and racism against Native peoples and violence against them play into it? Look, read the document and you're going to see it. But also, right, and there was real government problems in Mexico, and there really were real rights that all Texans, Anglo-Texans and Tejanos, were having taken away from them against the Mexican Constitution, right? So questions of actual freedom and liberty were real questions. And so a lot of times in the partisan conflict outside of our classrooms, what we get caught up is it one or the other? Like, is the story of Texas history freedom or slavery? Right. And in the classroom, I encourage you to pick up documents like this, because many of them will tell you, especially in a whole, maybe not every single individual, but as a whole, they'll say, well, yes, both. And right. It's both of these things. And the tricky part then becomes, how do we then hold those two things together in tension? And what do those two things and both of their legacies leave for us today? Right? Not one or the other, not pitting one group against the other today. As Dr. Bloom said, it's not about blaming someone alive today for what someone did 200 years ago, but it is about coming to understanding about how the various ideas functioned at the time and continue to have legacies to today.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin. Moving again, please do provide your questions in the chat box or via Facebook. Moving on to another question to Dr. Bloom. When you look at the whole critique and the issue about critical race theory, and many educators are in Texas are having to become defensive about critical race theory. And the fact is that most people don't teach critical race theory in their classroom, even though they may cover some aspects of African-American history. How do you think educators in Texas should handle the issue of critical race theory in terms of being challenged in the classroom?
Well, that's an interesting question, because children, this is not a theory that's taught at the K-12 level. It's a theory. If your child is being taught critical race theory, then I'd say congratulations, your child is in law school, or your child is in a university master's program. But critical race theory is if teachers are being challenged by this, and they know that this may become an issue, especially for minority teachers who are located in predominantly white schools. I've been a principal. I've seen parents come in and challenge what's being taught, how it's being taught. One of the things I would say, there are really two ways you could do it. You could immerse yourself in understanding exactly what critical race theory is. You could discuss how the TEKS in Texas doesn't have it anywhere in it to teach that to children at the K-12 level. But if it's brought up in the classroom by students, teachers should not back off from it. They need to discuss exactly what it is. It is a way of thinking about how the legal system has perpetuated racist and oppressive views to groups of people in America. And many of these views are located in institutions, and they're so pervasive as to be invisible. You don't know it. It doesn't matter, the way I've discussed it, it doesn't matter if you call me a name. I don't care if you, Ramona, call me a name. But it does matter to me if you were white and you sat on a board that writes policies for that institution, or a school board, the State Board of Education. So individually, critical race theory doesn't really amount to anything, but it's the institutionalization of people who are placed on boards like state boards, and that are allowed to create policies and programs and to omit information. Those are the people that really are the undergirding of why critical race theory exists.
So, please go ahead, Dr. Franklin.
Thank you. Well, I've thought I might jump off of what Dr. Bloom said, and also as a way to answer a question that has come in here from Nelva Williamson. This idea that, I mean, I'm sure most of you who are teachers know this. Like, I mean, I've taught Texas history at the university level for 7 years. I've never talked about critical race. Like the phrase critical race theory has never come up in my class. And I'm sure it's that way in your 4th grade Texas history classes and 7th grade. So I also just want to echo the idea that, how to handle this on the day-to-day as teachers, just teach what you're teaching, keep teaching what you're teaching. And when someone accuses you of critical race theory, you can really and honestly respond, I don't know what you're like. We don't talk about that. We're doing history or we're doing English. At the same time, I also echo Dr. Bloom's encouragement to be aware of it, learn about what it is, so that when your students ask, and they're going to, especially the older they are, if they pay any attention to what's going on, you have an answer to give, and so that you can advocate, especially outside of the classroom. And this goes to the question that Nelva Williamson has asked here about, will the Texas Education Agency begin rewriting Texas history TEKS to accommodate 1836 project? I don't think there's much in the 1836 project for them to rewrite according to. It's the other bill that's much more problematic. It's 3979 or Senate Bill 3, I think it is. That's the one that is much more problematic and restrictive about what teachers can do. I don't know. I don't want to be alarmist, but I will say I would not put it past them to write TEKS in such a way that gets in line with these bills. So that's the arena where I would encourage you to know about critical race theory, know about history and some of the conversations that are going on, so that you can advocate for members of the State Board of Education. So you can advocate for who are the experts that are being chosen to sit on boards to help choose textbooks, because often these experts are no experts at all. I mean, they've never taken even a history degree at any level in their entire lives. You can go find their names right now on the State Board of Education's website. So, so that's my encouragement, is to learn about it. But as you're in your classroom, honestly, like, protect yourself by just doing what you keep doing. But at the same time, outside of the classroom, learn so that you can advocate.
I would also say, to piggyback on what Brian has said, is that one of the advantages, and it's a very powerful advantage, for me teaching African American students about their history, I'm sorry, the history that they have not learned, is that it created, when I started talking about who sits on the State Board of Education, that writes these policies, that selects these books, they are people that are elected. That means you need to vote. The down ballot, what we call the local elections, the statewide elections, those impact you more on a daily basis than these federal elections, except for the president. But the local elections, even for your city, who's picking up your garbage, that impacts you locally. So one thing it did do, and I'm very proud of this, all of my students, when they would leave the class, all of them sent me text messages or emails and told me they voted for the first time and that they registered, because they learned the power of the vote. And they understood how not being apathetic about voting doesn't get you anywhere. So that was, and that only came from learning about their own history and how not being able to vote or being kept from voting allowed so many atrocities to come to them over the years.
I would like to ask the two of you to answer this one question, and then we're gonna let Dr. Houston bring us to a close. Does either of the bills that you looked at today, does either say that teachers cannot teach African American history? Because this is what I'm hearing in the general public.
No,
I'm hearing that repeated. Does either bill say you cannot teach African American history?
no, it doesn't say that. What it
Okay.
says is that if you do, where is it? I saw it today. If you do teach or discuss a certain document,
You have to do so fairly. You have to
yeah,
do
you
so
should do
in
so
an
fairly. Oh, it
even-handed
says
way.
a
Mhm.
teacher may not be compelled to discuss a particular current event or widely debated and currently controversial issue of public policy or social affairs. If a teacher chooses to discuss a topic described by subdivision 1, shall not, to the best of the teacher's ability, strive to explore the topic from diverse and contending perspectives.
Right.
That's
And I think
very
we-
important. Diverse and contending perspectives without giving deference to any one perspective. That's similar to speaking about religion.
Mhm.
You know, you can't, if I'm Catholic, I can't go in and advocate for Catholicism, but I can talk about religions in general,
Mhm.
just and take a neutral stance on any of them. So it doesn't say it in here.
May I add one thing? You're right. It does not. I agree. It does not say anything about not teaching like African American history, for example. There are a couple of things that Senate Bill 3 and HB 3979 do say, which I find the most problematic of everything that's been passed over the last couple of months. They do say that teachers may not discuss the advent of slavery in the US as constituting its true founding. Now, who gets to decide what true founding is a huge question. But I would argue that like that should be a topic that should be able to be discussed along with other views of what does it mean to be true founding, right? It also says that teachers cannot talk about slavery and racism as anything other than, this is a quote, deviations from, betrayals of, or failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the US. So what it's trying to say is the true founding principle of the US is freedom and liberty, and slavery and racism were a failure to live up to that. Well, as any historian will tell you, that's just not accurate. As I mentioned earlier, it's a both and situation, right? Freedom was absolutely a principle of the founding of the country, but so was slavery, race-based slavery.
Yeah.
So it doesn't say, no, don't tell African American history, but it does constrain the way in which we integrate the story of African Americans or non-whites, especially regarding slavery. It does attempt to constrain the way in which you teach it.
Right.
So all I could say is, again, man, just go to the documents and go to the history, and it comes out on its own. It's not hard. Like,
It really
it's like, what's the 13th Amendment? Why do we need that? Well, let me tell you why we needed to end slavery, because it was a law. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloom and Dr. Franklin, for giving us some insight and understanding about how to approach how we talk about and how we teach Texas history. One thing that is so unique about Texas history is we still, even though we're a state, we still believe we're our own country. And so we teach Texas history in 7th grade. A lot of states don't have their own state history that is taught in their school system. So therefore, the 1836 project is very much a part of the public educational system because we teach Texas history in our schools, not just American history. Thank you so much, Dr. Bloom, for just expanding upon the importance of voting. All politics is local, economics is global, and the people who represent us on the local level, whether it's city, county, or state, really dictate what happens to us in our daily lives. And teaching is one of those issues when you look at what textbooks we choose, as well as what topics we discuss in the classroom. And thank you, Dr. Franklin, for expanding upon the fact that all you need to do is teach the truth. And you go to the truth by going to those original documents. You don't have to interpret them. Just look at them, and you can see for yourself what these documents state. And so we want to educate our young people, so not only do they know how to learn, not only do they learn the skills of reading and writing, but they also learn the whole skill of critical thinking. Like Dr. Franklin stated, it's not either or, it's and both. And the only way you're able to become a good thinker and be able to think critically is being able to take different perspectives and different ideas and come up with your own interpretations. So we thank you both, Dr. Colette Bloom and Dr. Brian Franklin, for sharing your knowledge with us today and teaching. And thank you, Dr. Karen Kossie-Chernyshev and her committee for restarting the SWATH program, which is on Texas history, the study of African Americans in Texas. We know we took a little break there for the pandemic, but we thank you for reinstituting the program. And as many of you know, we have 2 more days of sessions, and we hope you will join us then. So I'll turn it right over to Dr. Karen Kossie-Chernyshev.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this discussion. And I did want to point to the chat where Nelva has mentioned that that 1836 project was a direct response to the 1619 project, right? Which they're not wanting us to teach. But those of us who teach history, there's no way you get around teaching 1619 and everything that goes along with that first slave ship that lands in the United States, right? So I want to thank you again for coming. We're going to be right back tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to have, let me share the screen just for a moment. We will have Dr. Merline Pitre, Texas Southern University, and we will also have Professor Tomiko Meeks. And our moderator tomorrow will be Nelva Williamson, history educator. She teaches advanced placement, and she's also this year co-director of SWATH. So I want to thank you again for coming. We're hoping that all of you will return tomorrow. We have more to talk about, and that you'll actually just be engaged with us for the next couple of days. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it.